Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to take a look at the electronic sales portion of your summer job project so that you can kind of work through the rest of it and understand the logic behind it. Now, every time you're working through something like this, your goal isn't just to do the math. Your goal is to understand how to actually use these kinds of calculations as you go through life, because life is a lot easier if you understand how math can actually inform you about the decisions that you're trying to make. So let's go ahead and dive in. Now, electronic sales, the pay is an hourly rate of $7.75. Now, this pay is going to be if you are 17 or younger. And then $8.25 if you are basically 18 or older. The moment you turn 18, the very second after that, you are technically over 18, which is why it's written this way, but it's a little confusing. Now, in addition to our hourly pay rate, we also make a 5% commission based on your weekly total sales. So this plus is quite literally going to be a plus sign as we work through this. All right, and it's based on our weekly total sales. So we're looking at 5% of weekly total sales. Now, in terms of hours, we are guaranteed that our hours, and I see it says to use H for the number of hours in a later part of the problem, so I'm going to go ahead and use H right now and say that H is always going to be between 30 hours and 40 hours inclusive. So you can actually get to 30 hours, you could get up to 40 hours, or you could get anything in between. So this is going to help us kind of figure out our lower bound and our upper bound for how much money we might make. Now, at the electronics store, sales associates average about $5,000 in sales each week. And our first question says that based on this average, what would your weekly commission be? So for that, we need to take 5% of that weekly total sales, so 5% of the 5,000. Now, 5% quite literally means 5 divided by 100. The percent sign means divide by 100, so that's what I'm doing. Notice I don't have the percent sign there anymore because I've already dealt with it by dividing by 100. And then 5 divided by 100 equals 0.05. So I'm going to use this number, and I'm going to take 0.05 of 5,000, which is 5,000 times 0.05. And when you work that out, you're actually going to get about $250. So this is how much you would actually get as your cut. Basically, you get in on the action on what you sold. It's one of the reasons that companies use commission is that the more you sell, the more you get to keep, and the more motivated you are to make that sale. So you're less likely to just stand around and not do anything. Now, write the expression you would use to calculate your hourly earnings. So this is the second half of our pay that we're looking at, because we have two parts of it. We have the hourly pay, and then we have our commission. So this is going to be the hourly pay portion of it. Now, when I was a senior in high school, I would have been 17 right about now. So I'm going to use the 17-year-old rate, which is $7.75. I am aware that minimum pay has actually changed in the last several years. This is from 2008. If you want to use the pay from the present time, please feel free to look it up and go ahead and use it. Now, in order to calculate this, I take my hourly pay and I'd have to multiply by my hours. So if I work 10 hours, I would take $7.75 times 10. If I work 20 hours, $7.75 times 20. Because I don't know my hours, but I know a letter I can use to represent it, I'm going to take $7.75 times H. Now, another way to write this is just 7.75 and the H right after it. If you prefer to have the parentheses to remind yourself to write those parentheses down to show your multiplication, you can do that. Or you can write it like this. Mathematicians tend to go for the shortest way of writing something, which is why we tend to drop those parentheses and any other symbols that show the multiplication. Now, once you have this, we can go through and actually play with this formula. let's see what we would make if we only worked 30 hours. So that's like the minimum number of hours that we could possibly be scheduled for. And if we only figure out our hourly pay, we sort of have the worst case scenario for our earnings, because we're looking at not having any commission and only getting to work 30 hours. And that would equal, let me go ahead and work through this. Let's see, 7.75 times 30 gives us 232.5. All right, so 232. Now that 0.5 has to turn into a 50 cents. Anytime you're dealing with math that's in context, you do actually need to put the numbers back in the form they should be in based on the context of the problem. Now you're dealing with dollars and cents. Dollars and cents are always written to 2 decimal places. So please do make sure that you actually put that 0 at the end. If you try to write a check and you just write 232.5 instead of 232.50, people are going to look at you a little oddly because you're not writing the way that money should be written. You always have to use the proper form. Please do practice that. Now, what would you earn hourly if you work a full 40-hour week? So again, this is not including commission. We just want to know worst case scenario if we don't sell anything. And right now during the pandemic, this is very appropriate to the times, because not everyone's going to be able to sell what they normally would because not a ton of people are going into stores. This is one of those times when relying on commission is actually a detriment instead of a help. So if we take $775 times 40, we have $310. So if you sell absolutely nothing during the week, you're going to make at minimum $232.50. Now this is considered your gross pay. Gross pay means that this is what you are owed before taxes are taken out, before health insurance, before any sort of retirement benefits. This is what you're making. That's the foundation of your paycheck. And then everything else kind of gets taken out from it. So you don't actually have this amount put into your bank account. This is what you're starting with before tax is taken out. So this is the lowest amount that you could make because you're always guaranteed at least 30 hours. So this is your 30 hours. But you're not guaranteed to sell anything, which is why we're not looking at commission. Now, best case scenario, if you, again, don't sell anything, is this 310, because the most hours that you could possibly be scheduled to work is 40. Right? They don't let anyone work over 40, and the reason for that is probably that they don't want to pay overtime. In a future problem, you'll see how to deal with overtime. Now, what would your gross paycheck be if you worked 30 hours and sold the $5,000 in merchandise? So this "and" means that we have to add two things together. So hourly pay plus commission. Now our hourly pay was $775 times 30 because of the 30 hours. And that was $232.50. Plus our commission if we sell $5,000 worth of merchandise, that was the $5,000 times 0.05 that we figured out up in part A. All right? Remember when we were working this part out? If you sell $5,000 worth of merchandise, you get to keep 5% of that dollar amount. And 5% of $5,000 is $250. That's your cut of the weekly sales. So down here, we're adding $232.50, which is the hourly pay, plus the $250 you get from selling stuff. And when you add those two together, 250 plus 232.5 equals about $482.50. Again, on my calculator, you'll see that it says 42.5. However, I wrote 42.50. That 0 is because the 0.5 represented 50 cents, and when you're dealing with dollars and cents, you have to write it to 2 decimal places. Please don't leave off that 0. Think about how you would look at someone who wrote down a dollar amount that they wanted you to pay, and they only wrote a 0.5 and they didn't write a 0.50 when they wanted you to pay 50 cents at the end. You wouldn't think that they knew what they were doing, would you? You need to make sure that you are showing that you know what you're doing. All right, now write an equation for your weekly earnings, W, where H represents the total number of hours that you may work, assuming average weekly sales of 5,000. Now here's where our expressions turn into equations. And our weekly earnings, that's what we've been figuring out this entire time. We've been figuring out what they equal. And W represents the weekly earnings, so we've been figuring out what W equals. We've been doing that by taking 7.75 times whatever the hours were that we were working. Now again, our hours can be changeable. So up here we had written an expression for this. Since we don't know exactly how many hours they want us to work with, we need to have 7.75, and we're going to go back to H instead of like this times 30 or this times 40 that I had previously. Now remember, your full pay is your hourly pay plus the commission. So I need to add on my commission, and they're telling us right now that we're assuming weekly sales of 5,000. So that 5,000 isn't varying from week to week, which means it doesn't need a variable. The letters that we use in equations are purely to help us keep track of where numbers should be that we don't know yet. We don't know our hours yet, so we're using H in place of that. We do know how much we're supposed to be able to sell, and we know that we need to take 5% of that. So in this case, we don't actually need a variable. It would just be the $250 that we had previously worked out. It didn't matter whether I calculated 5,000 times 0.05 here, or if I calculated 5,000 times 0.05 here. It turns out to be the same answer no matter what. It's a constant answer. So since I'm still using that same amount of sales, I have that constant answer. Constants in equations are numbers without variables. And the numbers without variables never change because there's nothing to make them vary. Right? This right here would be your equation. Finally, these last few parts have us use this equation. So using your equation from part F, calculate your gross paycheck. Again, remember, gross means your total paycheck, how much they owe you before taxes and everything else is taken out. So gross paycheck for a week if you worked 40 hours and sold the $5,000 in merchandise. So this is telling me that I can go ahead and use this equation, and instead of H, I now know how many hours I need to deal with. So 40 is going to replace the H. Right? W equals 7.75 times 40 plus the 250, because that $5,000 in sales hasn't changed. So that 250 that I had here and that I had previously, it's still there. Now if we work this out, 40 times 775 was $310. If we add on the $250 from our commissions, then we're going to get $500.60, or sorry, $560, my bad. So we have $560 right here. This is our best case scenario. So if we're an average salesperson and we work the most hours that we possibly can, 40 hours, then we could make up to $560 per week. Now, H takes into account the fact that you might not always get that 40 hours. So you find out that your total sales average, that if your total sales average $5,000 per week, you would typically be scheduled to work 35 hours per week. So you're not normally going to get this 40, maybe only if you cover a shift for someone. But you are most likely to get 35, which would be your typical week. So 7.75 times 35, and then still adding on that $250, because again, your total sales is 5,000 for the week, and 5% of that is where we got that 250. And if you work this part out, 7.75 times 35 is $271.25 plus the $250 equals $521.25. All right, so this is what we would typically make if we're able to make our usual sales and if we're scheduled for the usual amount of time based on those sales. Often if people sell less, then they get fewer hours. You'd be dropped back down to the 30 that we were looking at up here. People who sell the most, so much more than 5,000, would probably be scheduled for the 40 hours because they're more likely to make money for the company. And then not only would they be earning more hourly, they would also be earning more in terms of commission. But people who just tend to do the average amount, this is what they would typically make. Now, this is where you start looking at the information that you really need to have to do your budgeting. So you sit down and calculate that you will need at least $500 per week to pay for college expenses. How many hours would you have to work in your sales job each week, and assume that you would sell 5,000 in merchandise. So this time we're letting you assume that it's a normal type of year, you're going to sell 5,000 in merchandise. Now this 500, previously we had been putting numbers in place of H because we had hours. This right here is supposed to be our weekly pay, which would be the W. So we're not putting anything in for H, we're going to have to solve for H. What we're going to do is set 500 equal to 775 times H plus 250. Now I'm still keeping that 250 because it told me to assume that I would sell 5,000 in merchandise. When you're solving equations like this, you are going to use reverse order of operations. Order of operations normally goes parentheses, exponents, multiplication or division, whichever comes first as you read from left to right, and then addition or subtraction, again, whichever comes first as you read from left to right. So PEMDAS typically doesn't actually go straight down into PEMDAS. These two are the same level of operations, multiplication, division, that's why they're able to undo each other. And the same sort of thing with addition and subtraction. Now instead of starting with parentheses, like you do when you know all the numbers, you're going to start at the bottom and work your way up when you're trying to find one of your numbers. So that means I need to take this addition and subtraction and look through this and see if I have any addition or subtraction that's not inside of parentheses. I do. I have this plus 250. Now the opposite of adding 250 is subtracting 250, which would allow me to undo it. So I'm going to subtract 250 from this side, but what I do to one side, in order for it to stay equal, I have to do to the other. Now, what math teachers mean by sides is that you have the left side of your equal sign over here, and you have the right side of your equal sign over here. The values on the left and the values on the right should be the same amount. If I remove the value from this side, I have to remove that same value from this side. This zeroes out, leaving me with just 7.75H. Now over here, 500 minus 250 equals 250. And now I can undo the last number that's still attached to my variable. Now, 7.75 is attached through multiplication. Remember, we set this up originally to be a multiplication problem. The hourly pay times number of hours. So if we go down to here, I need to undo this multiplication with its opposite, and its opposite of multiplication is right next to its division. So I'm going to divide by 775, and what that does is 7.75 divided by 7.75 equals 1. And 1H can just be written as H, and you don't need to show the number. That's how this removes that 7.75. It doesn't actually remove it, it turns it into 1, and 1 times H is just H. What I do to one side, I must do to the other. And 250 divided by 7.75 is equal to about, see, I'm going to put my wavy lines here because this is approximate, 32 hours, see, 32.26 hours. So how many hours would I have to work in my sales job each week? Let's assume that they don't give us partial hours, or that they only give us maybe half hours. So I would say about 32.5 or more hours. Change my 5 so it actually looks like a 5. So if they give you half hours, then you could actually go with 32.5 hours. If they only give you whole hours, then it would have to be 33 or more hours. You can't drop down to 32 because if you put 32 in here, let's go ahead and test that. 7.75 times 32 plus 250 equals 498. You would not make at least 500, which is what you need. Now, if you take 7.75 times 32.5, and then plus the 250. You're going to get just over the 500, which is why I'm saying 32.5 or more. Or you could even go up higher than that, and that would make this number climb, letting you have at least the $500 for your college expenses. All right, so the whole goal of this is to figure out what math is needed to get the answer to, can I afford what I'm about to do? Should I take this job, or should I look for a different one? It's kind of rough to set yourself up to have to work 2 jobs if you can avoid it by taking another job that you're offered at the same time, which is when you guys are going to be looking through these other jobs. So you have the construction job, and you have the restaurants job, and at the very end of this, you're taking a look through these. Now with the sales associate, that's the one that we just looked at. The lowest weekly gross paycheck with 30 hours was 30 hours with no commission. So basically our answer from part C right here, so 30 hours, no commission, that would be the lowest gross weekly paycheck. So 232.50. The typical gross paycheck was the one that was 35 hours and 250 for our commission, so it was right here. Because they said that if your sales total is this on average, you are going to be working 35. So this was calculating your typical weekly gross paycheck. So that would be 521.25. And then the highest weekly gross paycheck was the one with 40 hours, still with 5,000 in sold in merchandise for 250 for your commission. And that was 500 and, my numbers are getting a little messed up, $560. So you're making a table to compare what's the lowest my pay could go, what's my usual paycheck, and then what's the highest it could go. And then you're going to answer these questions to try to figure out which job is actually going to be the best for what you need. All right, so you're practicing the skills that you need to apply this type of math in life so that math can make your life easier as you go through. All right, have a wonderful rest of the day, and I'll see you in class.